Jeremy, I'd like to discuss loyalties. You're from Wales originally, and I imagine you were born, like me, either in the 40s or the 50s.
Oh, 60s, of course. Yeah.
Does this incline you to have some loyalty to some form of an Anglo-Saxon empire? And if so, explain. If not, what are you loyal to?
Well, what a deep and meaningful question that is. I mean, I left Wales when I was 5 years old, and I lived in Malaya for a year. Then I came to Australia, and I went to school in Australia, in Tasmania, and then I went overseas when I was 21. Went back overseas, went to Beirut, went to London. So I don't really have a kind of a sense of loyalty to a territory, a blind loyalty. I have more loyalty to people and to causes. I think I always have done, and the kind of my identification with oppressed people goes back a long way. I remember when I was a little boy, a young boy anyway, going to the cinema in Launceston, which is quite marvellous in those days. You'd get 2 feature films plus cartoons, and generally you get a sword fighting film, and a cowboy and Indian film, and I was always on the side of the Indians. I somehow knew, right, that they were in the right and the cowboys were in the wrong. So there's kind of a long development of attitude on my part. But in terms, do I feel any loyalty to Britain? No, not at all. And even if I did, I'd be extremely critical if the British government were following policies I couldn't agree with. And if I were loyal, well, of course I wouldn't support the policy of the British government in the Middle East over the last half century. They've been extremely destructive. And as living in Australia and having Australian nationality as well, I'm highly critical of what the Australian government's doing. Here, in Australia, their policies towards asylum seekers and boat people, we're just now dealing with this, and Kevin Rudd's policy to me is despicable, completely despicable. It's kind of upping the ante from what John Howard did. They're in a kind of outbidding match, and their policies on the Middle East have been kind of are shocking. They always have been. They've always taken the side of Israel against the Palestinians. Critical of Hamas, critical of. They follow the line. Unfortunately, Australia's always followed an outside line. First a British line, then the American line. And we plunge into war after war because we follow those lines. This is a measure to me that Australia still has to achieve its proper independence. It's still kind of tailgating outside powers. And somehow it's got to break free of that historical kind of connection. And then it can be called properly independent.
You're an academic. Why are there so few academics in Australia talking in the way you do about the Middle East?
I'm not in Australia. Does that answer the question? I mean, it's a starting point. I mean, I don't want to present myself as any kind of person who suffered from my own views, because I haven't really, but these are very, very difficult questions. I mean, if you're an academic in America, for example, if you hold strong pro-Palestinian views, you're going to be in trouble. You are really going to be in trouble. And this has happened on many, many occasions. We know some outstanding cases, like Norman Finkelstein is probably the best known to anyone. Finkelstein has published many, many books. He's an outstanding figure. He holds very strong views. He doesn't kind of mince his words. He doesn't fool students. He gives them what he thinks is true, and I think it's what every academic should do. And he's suffered for it. I don't know what his situation is now, but he was denied tenure. And there are other cases. Joseph Mussalaha at Columbia University came under a very sustained campaign to get him sacked because of his views on the Middle East, and particularly the Israeli-Palestine question. And to a degree it's the same here. If you're in an Australian university and you start speaking out really, really strongly and critically, a lot of pressure, I have no doubt, would be brought from behind the scenes, to quieten you down. And of course if you don't have tenure, if you don't have any security, well, I guess you'd be foolish, to speak out too critically, too radically, because you might find that kind of job security would never come your way. And I think that, in these days of the enterprise university and the way that academics kind of have to perform and have to fulfill certain criteria, and they have to look after their careers, and they've got to get money, and they've got to get funding and grants and all the rest of it. It's a different kind of world from what it was 30 years ago. And I think that I don't want to be too critical about this, but it is a fact that in Australia you don't see many academics speaking out on these issues. They don't. They simply don't. I'm not aware of anyone. I mean, Saikal in Canberra, I haven't seen any articles from him for a long time. He spoke out fairly strongly, But the very few others speak out. I mean, I'm not aware of anyone speaking out on the Syria question. Okay, I'm not in Australia. I do read the media. I try to follow things. But I haven't seen any kind of strong position being developed against the campaign that's been launched against the Syrian government. And it is a campaign. And we are seeing incredible propaganda. And to say that is not to say that everything the Syrian government is doing is right. No, it's not. Because this is a system that needs to change. And there are very strong criticisms being made of the Syrian government. But still, one has to find the right balance, the right path through all of this, and what is in Syria's best interests. And is what is happening now in Syria's best interests, this terrible campaign of destruction that's been launched against Syria. You almost couldn't think of anything worse. The only worse thing would be if the outside powers had managed to get a resolution through the Security Council and launch an open air attack. And that would have led to phenomenal destruction. But what we're seeing already is just terrible. And yet I don't see any, I have not seen any kind of critical articles in the mainstream media, written by academics, dealing with the situation. They're just not there. They're not there. And I'm trying to be polite here, but I think they're protecting themselves, keeping their noses clean, keeping their heads down, staying out of trouble, looking after their own interests.
Yes, Edward Said talked about that I know in one of his books covering Islam, and that's the point he made. Basically, academics look after their own interests often.
Yes, they do. I mean, you call me an academic. I'd rather prefer to say I just teach at university. That's what I do, But, I think about this, and I kind of think that if you're at university and you're not prepared to say what you think is true, if you spend your time creating false balance, false symmetry, hedging your bets all the time, you leave your students confused. I think it's much better to say, well, I think this is what's going on. And then the students come back at you and say, well, I don't think that's true, and you can develop a debate, a discussion. So I think that's what an academic should be doing. And we know that history, modern history in particular, and particularly Middle Eastern history, it's a battlefield. We can say Australian history is a battlefield. We have some very strong Australian academics, Henry Reynolds, for example. He's a good man, and he says what he thinks, and of course we know he's coming from a lot of criticism, and that's what happens. If you're a strong-minded historian, and if you're actually trying to be true to yourself and to history, and to say what you think, you might be wrong. That's not the point. You're being true to yourself. This is what I think is true, and then if someone else comes back with a logical response, and says, well, actually, did you think of this and that and that? Then you can say, oh, okay, you're right. I'll have to modify my views on the basis of what you told me. That's the natural kind of discussion you'd have on any issue. But I think you have to be forthright in the first place. And if you're not prepared to do that, you're not prepared to take the risks of being marginalised, criticised, isolated, and not getting the grants and all the rest of it, well, do something else. Get out. Go and sell real estate. You won't have to deal with these moral, philosophical problems. That's how I see it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.